Welcome to the second part of our course, How to Turn Snapshots into Photographs, third week. This session is going to be on depth of field, how to control your depth of field, what will be in focus, and how to broaden or narrow your depth of field. Like on the left is nice broad depth of field, on the right is a shallow depth of field. The depth of field, the concern here, some people go to focus. What do I do with that? How do I fix it? Depth of field refers to what appears to be in focus when you take your picture. You need to know that there's only one point in a picture that's ever exactly in focus, but the points around it are close enough to being in focus that the eye thinks it's in focus, but it really isn't. In terms of focus, what matters is that the eye is attracted to two things: light, what is brightly lit, and two, what is in focus, what is sharp. So we want to make sure, if we want people to look at stuff, it better be in focus. So you can control your what is in focus with two things, or three things actually: your lens choice or your zoom position, wide angle or telephoto, your aperture setting, wide open or closed down, and your distance to the subject, close up or far back. Why it matters? Well, with a shallow depth of field, you're removing distractions. If you want people to focus on one aspect of it but not others, put the other things out of focus. A big depth of field is important when you have groups of people or a scene. You want everyone to be in focus. So here's an example of a shallow depth of field. This is kind of an artsy picture, essentially looking at the nose of Leatherman pliers. You see how the depth of field falls off real fast. It's an interesting picture because of the tonal things up top, but the sharp focus is really where your eye gets stuck. That's what macro lens shot at f2.8. In other words, small number means wide, big open hole, shallow depth of field. This next picture is a picture of the arbutus tree. This was shot with a wide angle lens at f22. So a wide angle lens with a tiny little hole, which means a big number. And so the depth of field goes from the grass at the bottom to the leaves at top. Now, here is a way of looking at it. If we compare these two pictures, I'll put them both up right now. The pliers, where in shallow depth of field, you see where the camera is? And the depth of field is between those two red lines. That's the depth of field. The little red line in the middle is exactly the focal point. That's where everything is in perfect focus. But in front of it by 1/3 and behind it by 2/3 is effective depth of field. You see, everything seems to be in focus. But look at the second picture, wide angle lens with the arbutus tree. Then what happens here is that the depth of field is going from way just in front of the camera to way back to the mountains. Everything's in focus. Again, the best focus point is 1/3 into the frame, so where that guy is. Point here is, what is the point here? The point here just shows you that with the wide angle lens versus the telephoto lens, you're going to get a different telephoto effective depth of field. Alrighty here. So aperture settings, this is the little hole in your camera, the f-stop, 1.4, see how wide open it is? f16 is a tiny little hole. It essentially is the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. So here's an example, wide open depth of field, or at least a wide open aperture, shooting at that bottle, and you can see the background's really fuzzy. Move it to 5.6 and watch what happens. Woo, now the background's starting to come into focus. Turn it down to 16, which is a tiny little hole, and look what happens. The background isn't in focus, but you can see a lot of the detail. Look at the difference between the f1.4 and the 16. So if you take a picture and you really want the background to be fuzzy, open up your iris wide and let your shutter adjust for the proper light balance. Second thing is proximity, how close you are to the subject. The further away you are from the subject, the greater the depth of field. So here we are 2 meters away from that bottle again with a 28mm lens. Now let's get closer with the same lens and see what happens. And look what happens to the background. So the closer you are, the more the background gets blurry. So if you want it to be blurry, get close to your subject, and you can see how it changes the effect. Thirdly is lens choice. The wider the lens, zoomed out, zoomed in, I should say, the greater the depth of field. So the wider when you have a little zoom on your camera, go back to wide angle so you get lots of people in it, or the whole scene, you're going to have your best depth of field there. Zoom out to the end of your zoom range, or put on a telephoto lens, and you're going to have a very narrow depth of field. So this is that wide angle, and this is zoomed all the way back to 28 millimeters. Now let's telephoto out, and look what happens again. So we're staying in the same place, but zooming in on that bottle, and look what happens to the depth of field. So in summary, how to achieve the desired depth of field using aperture priority. Put your camera on the little dial, turn it on to A mode. Use a large aperture like f2. Some of your cameras, the smallest aperture is 3.5, but get the smallest number, and then move closer to your subject and zoom in. All those strings will contribute to a shallow depth of field. How's this? Only the eye of this little frog is in focus. You can't see the fact that he's sitting on my hot tub, which would have wrecked the picture. For a large depth of field, use a small aperture like f16, so put an aperture priority again, but turn the aperture setting to as high as it'll go, and move further away from your subject, and zoom out using a wide angle lens. And the sign here, St. Mary's Magdalene Church, and the church are in focus. That's how it works. So here's an example. I was taking pictures of tulips in my kitchen, a little messy, and that's my fault, not my honey's. Should have cleaned up. And here's the setting. You can see that we're looking through the back of the camera. I'm using my coat to create a negative, or we call negative space, just a black background. All we want to see is the tulips. And this is a macro lens, so it's a kind of like a telephoto lens, so it's going to be a shallow depth of field. The depth of field is going to go anywhere from 1 inch to 6 inches, depending on how close I am. In this case, I'm fixed. And the second thing would be the opening of the iris. So let's take a look at the first picture. This is on auto mode. You can see that the picture is overexposed. So again, another reason to get your camera, start controlling your camera, is you want to change the shutter speed. The exposure here is auto and it's overexposed. So I use aperture compensation. It's a little dial on your camera where you can say, okay, take the same picture, but underexpose it by 2 stops. I think I showed you that in the class. And here's the picture properly exposed. You can also put your camera on manual and adjust the settings until the picture comes out right. Now here's the close-up shots. So this is 1/80th of a second at f3. You notice that the front of the tulips are in focus, but the one right behind it immediately is out of focus. Change it to f11 and take a look. Now we've got the first 2 flowers are in focus. And go down to f22, and it's almost in focus all the way to the back. If you look at the picture on the bottom versus the picture on the top, you can see the back flower getting sharper and sharper and sharper, and that's only being caused by turning my iris to a higher setting from f3 to f22. Now, in this particular case, I used f3, but I focused 1/3 into the picture, and you can see that the second flower is getting in focus. And now when I did the same thing with the f20, I focused on 1/3 into the picture. Now you can see that the front of the flowers are in focus and the back of the flowers in focus. And if we compare the two there, you can see f3 up top, f20 in the bottom. If you are taking pictures of flowers with a telephoto lens and you want to have great depth of field, turn your iris to a high setting to get that depth of field. You probably, like me, would have to use a tripod. Anyway, that's what we did in class, and I think your homework was to practice with this stuff. And I'll send you an email to what the actual homework was. Oh, here it is right here. Okay. So we want you to fiddle with your aperture. And these are the 2 exercises I want you to do. And you can freeze this and write it down. Maybe I'll send it as an email. I don't know. Okay, indeed. So aperture, take a picture. And on aperture priority mode. And take a picture 4 feet away from the subject, whatever it may be. Maybe get a friend stand by the window or outside in the field, and use a wide angle setting. Zoom way back so you've got as much in the picture as possible. Then take a picture with your wide open aperture, 3.5 if that's your widest, and take a second picture at f22. And then take a look at your pictures and see what happens to the depth of field. The second task is focal length or zoom position. So in program mode, use just the automatic settings. Take a wide angle setting, landscape perspective, picture. Put a person in the picture so that in the picture is half person and half background, and have the background in the distance. So take a picture with your wide-angle lens at that in that way. The picture contains half person, and background contains half trees or whatever it is. Then I want you to walk backwards. Zoom your camera to its most zoomed position. Walk as far back as you have to go to get essentially the same position of the human being. So if the person's on the right-hand side, you can see their head and their waist. Zoom in, but then walk backwards until the picture is the same, has the same size person in other words, covers their head and their waist. And look what happens to the background. Notice how it will go out of focus. Okay, experiment with that, and send me some examples on the internet, and we'll bring a few to class. I don't want to spend quite as much time reviewing pictures this week, but bring your special ones and we'll take a look. Call me if you have problems. Take care.